right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, I feel like we're back. I want to put us back in college or high school debate days. Okay? And here is the assertion that I would like to debate pro and con for, right? The Ten Commandments is the most important section of the Torah. That is the assertion. The Ten Commandments is the most important section of the Torah. Think about it for a moment. I would love to hear some people argue in favor of that statement and some people argue against that statement. So we'll let Judy start and we'll go back and forth. Do you want to argue in favor or against?
I would say against because there are 613 commandments, so those are just 10 of them.
Okay, so Judy argues against that statement because there are 613 commandments and these are just 10 of those commandments. Okay? Who would like to make a statement for? We're going to go back and forth. They're done twice. I like that, right? There's very few sections of the Torah that we have repeated in quite the same way. These 10 commandments were done twice. Okay, against. Vard. Say it again? Four? Hold on, we need an against first. Against. So as a rebuttal to Barbara, they are repeated, but they're repeated with differences. They're not exactly the same. Hold on one second. We'll get to Vard in a sec. Vard, go ahead.
Oh, I said 4.
Yeah, 4 now.
Oh.
We're going back and forth.
A rebuttal to Judy.
Okay.
I think that all of the commandments can be summed up in the 10.
So perhaps we can argue that all the commandments can be summed up in these 10 commandments that we have here. Therefore, these are sort of like the either the Reader's Digest version or what's it called? These are the abstract, like at the beginning of a scholarly article, right? Okay, did you want to rebut?
Say that the difference is you got Shamor and Zahor.
Yes. So the difference is, Barbara's going to respond, is there are differences, but they're really not that significant. They're not substantive differences, right? It's still observe Shabbat, but yeah, there's a little difference in the word in terms of Shamor and Zachor and some of the other ones. Okay? Anybody else? All right, Dita.
7 of those commandments are for everybody. So certainly they are the most important.
7 of those commandments are for everybody, and by the way, just finish your thought, and the other 3 are for the Jews, right? The Jews, right? So there's 3 of the commandments that are very specific to the Jews, like Shabbat, right? But the other commandments, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, most societies in some way have those commandments or those laws as part of it, and therefore it's universal, okay? Britt?
So I'm going to go
Against, go ahead.
So I guess one way you could look at it is you're being told do this, don't do this, do this, don't do this. Whereas you look at the rest of the Torah itself, that where is the inspiration and where do you find your place of growth and connectivity? That's just not a law. Do this, do this, do this.
Interesting. So you're making an argument, which I like the argument, Britt, is that the way these commandments are written, or as commandments, or pronouncements, really, Aser HaDibrot really mean the 10 pronouncements. They don't really mean commandments because that would be the Aser HaMitzvot, right? That would be 10 commandments. But Aser HaDibrot, these 10 pronouncements, are done in such a way that's very clear cut, right? You shall not. Whereas the rest of the Torah really gives a lot of inspiration. It gives that spiritual background to everything. Okay? Anybody else? Fred?
Without an oral tradition, you don't have a complete understanding of Torah. So I would say against oral tradition is necessary.
Great. So Fred is arguing against because by themselves, they really don't, there's not enough, right? So yes, observe the Sabbath day, keep the Sabbath day, but what does that mean? right? Without the oral Torah, without everything else that comes with it, we don't know how to keep Shabbat. We don't know how to do those sorts of things, right? What does it mean to honor your father and mother? There's a lot of rabbinic interpretation on what does that mean? How far does the honoring go? What if they're not good people? What if they don't keep the commandments and are telling you not to? Are you supposed to honor them? There's all of this other Torah that comes along with it that you're arguing, Fred, we need, and therefore by itself, it isn't enough. Michal? So without the clarity and the directness of these commandments to say, look, this is sort of the clear-cut, you shall not, people wouldn't have a foundation on which to build all the rest of these things.
Well, the first commandment, there is no God besides me.
Right?
If you don't have a God, what else matters?
Right. So the first commandment is, you shall have no other God besides me. If you don't have that, nothing else really matters. I will say to you, though, which is very interesting, I was going to go into this and then I decided not to, but since it's in my head, I'll bring it up now. There's a dispute between Rambam and Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, right? Similar sounding names, but different people, as to whether or not, how to count the commandments. Rambam feels that the first commandment, you shall have no other God, or I am the Lord your God, actually is a commandment. Ramban feels it is not. It's just an introduction. He counts them differently. Both of them come up with 10, but there's a dispute in terms of which exactly are the 10, and whether or not that first, Anochi, I am the Lord your God, is a commandment or not a commandment, right? Or pronouncement or not a pronouncement. Anybody else? Judy?
I would say that different parts of the Torah are more important to different people.
Okay.
Some people might say the Shema and the Hafta are more important. If you ask a child, they probably say Noah and the ark because it has animals.
I like it. I like it. Judy's argument is that there are different parts of the Torah that are important for different people. For some people, it's these 10 commandments. For others, it's the Shema and the Ve'ahavta. Judy says if you ask a child, it may be, Noah's ark, and because they like the animals, right? We resonate, we connect to different sections. So this conversation, Bert. Yeah. I like that. I was wondering if somebody was going to say that. You're right on, Bert. So the 10 Commandments, at least the first version of them, were actually were written down by God's own hand. The rest of them were not. And so maybe that gives an extra added import to these 10 Commandments. So here's what I would say. I want to talk about two different things. Number one, how important the 10 Commandments should be. How central they should be within our daily conversation, even within our liturgy, is an argument that actually the rabbis have had for many, many centuries. It's very clear if you look at the older Sidurim, at the older prayer books, the 10 Commandments were part of our liturgy. We said them as part of the service every day. Well, that would argue they're pretty important, right? We don't say other things. We say the Shema twice a day. So if we say the 10 Commandments on a daily basis as part of our liturgy, that would argue these are pretty important. But if you look at our liturgy today, we don't have it in there. The 10 Commandments isn't there. Anybody know why? The 10 Commandments were removed from our liturgy with intention. Why?
I think one reason was so that people would not focus on them as being the only things that are important.
Exactly. So Mike says, so that people will not focus on them as being the only things that are important. And where might we get that from?
I think the rabbis.
Yes, Michal. Right? The Christian world focuses on these 10 commandments as, frankly, being the only ones that are important enough that we still should observe. Because remember, Christianity, especially after Paul, moved away from the law as being the focus, but they still maintain these 10 commandments as being central. And so in Christianity, they said these are the only ones really that are important, and the other ones are not. Kosher, not so important, right? All these other things, not so important, but these 10 are. And so there was actually an intentional statement by the rabbis to say, well, wait, if we have only these 10 commandments in our liturgy, we're feeding into that same ideology, and therefore they removed it to say all 613 are important, not these 10 over everything else. So it was the rabbis ultimately that did it, but it was because of the world situation, right? It was because of Christianity that focused on these as being the most important. Okay? Yes?
Just to add in a different sense, I mean, people break these commandments all the time, and it was kind of demoralizing. I mean, you know, to have, you could think of people in your own community who break these rules every day.
Yes. So in that case, I would put that argument as they're not more important than anyone else than any of the other ones, because we break these just as often as we break the other ones. Right? So it's not that. Now, I would argue that some people would say, look, most people would say, do not murder, do not steal. Most people are not breaking those on a daily basis. There are people in our society that break those commandments. But I would venture to say most of us sitting in this room, right, have not broken those commandments. I'm going out on a limb, all right? I'm going out on a limb. I'm looking around, right? But most people haven't. Now, there are other commandments, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Okay. Well, as we start to dig into what that means, right, there may not be people who are idolaters sitting in this room, but maybe there are people who put other ideas before God, whether it be money or power or fame or those sorts of things. There are a lot of rabbis that would say that breaks that commandment. So, yes, I think the fact is we do break these commandments. Certainly Shabbat, right? We do break these commandments, certainly honoring our parents, certainly coveting, which we'll get to, right? So we do break these just the same as we break everyone else for the most part, and therefore, maybe they're not more important. Maybe they're not more important. So issue number one is for us to understand that there really was, I would argue, within our tradition, a focus on these 10 commandments as being an elevated level to the other ones, right? An elevated level to the other ones. First of all, they were in the liturgy. They were the ones that we focused on every day. They were the ones, which we're going to get back to in a second, that sort of shape society. And I really like Bert's answer, right? They were the ones that were written by God's own hand. At least the first version, until Moses broke it, and then he had to do it himself the second time. Okay? So, if we're going to make the argument, and I'm okay with this argument, that these have something special to teach us, these 10 have something special to teach us different than the other 603, what is it? What do these commandments teach us? How do they guide us, lead us differently than any of these other commandments that are there? Nancy.
A lot of the other laws are directed towards community building. These are all focused on yourself.
So I'll push back on that, Nancy. What Nancy said is a lot of the other laws are community related. These are focused on the self. Some of them are focused on the self, and some of them are in fact focused on community, right? I mean, creating saying do not murder, do not steal, that creates a just community in which to live. It's not just about the self. True, but a lot of the other 603 are about your actions as well, whether it's kosher, whether it's whatever. So, I mean, yes, I hear what you're saying, but it's not quite so cut and dried, I think. It's not quite so cut and dried. Deb?
I haven't done the math on this, but I can't help but wonder if all the other ones fall into one of those buckets.
If all the other ones fall into one of the buckets of the 10?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit. There is an argument to be made that many of them can be subsumed within these 10, but it's, again, not so cut and dried. It's not so cut and dried. Marge?
But maybe those 10, if we follow those, society could be okay.
Okay. And by the way, this is the same argument that Christians made for why these 10 commandments are so important. Marge says, if we follow these 10 commandments, society would be okay. Society would be okay. We're going to push back on that in a second. You want to say?
But maybe without following the others, we as individuals can't be okay.
But if we don't follow the others, we as individuals can't be okay. So it's a good question, Marge. And I would say, of the answers that we're saying, I think this is more, there's more, in the Venn diagram, there's more in connection with this. But here's where I'll push back on that, right? Judaism has a very strong feeling on what society needs as a basis for a good society. Anybody know where we get that? I'll give you a hint. There are only 7 laws. There you go, right? Thank you, Debbie. Right? The 7 laws of Noah. 7 laws of Noah. And that is the minimum, according to our tradition, of what a good society has to have. Now, some of them are the same as the 10 Commandments. Do not murder, do not steal. Those are still there. But others are things like set up a system of courts and judgment. Do not tear a limb from a living creature. Right? So they establish different ideas of basic ethical moral behavior that are not necessarily in the 10 Commandments. So on the one hand, I would say, yes, these 10 Commandments take us a great deal in what a good society can be, but there are A, things that are missing, and B, well, does everybody have to believe in God to be in a good society? Maybe not. Is that just for the Jews? Is that for everybody? Right? And so we're struggling with all of this. Here's what I will say. The 10 Commandments have been divided into different groups, right? The most common of which we see is it's the 5 and 5. And I think people like that because, there's this image of the 2 tablets, right? And unless you are a Mel Brooks fan, when he comes down with 3 and breaks 1, right? There were 5 on each, right? There were 5 on each. And so we divided into 5 and 5. And so you could argue that the first 5 are about God, community, right? And the second 5 are really about society, okay? And how to build a good society. There's some that kind of go back and forth and make that a little bit difficult. But one of the ways that I actually really like thinking about this comes from Rabbi Sachs, actually. And he talks about it in his book on ethics. And he actually highlights the fact that there are a lot of, the pattern of numbers are 3 pairs and an individual, or a set of 3 and a standalone, right? So we see the first 2 days of creation, the second 2 days of creation, the third 2 days of creation, and then Shabbat. And that's a pattern that we see in a number of different places. And so he says, well, does this work for the 10 Commandments? To do 3 laws, 3 laws, 3 laws, 1 law, right? And when you do it that way, he finds something very interesting. He says the first three, no other God besides me, no graven images, no taking God's name in vain, these define, their purpose is to define the Jewish people as one nation under God, he puts in quote, right? Our connection as a people under God. That is those first three commandments. The second three, Shabbat, honoring parents, and prohibition against murder, are all, he says, principles about the createdness of life. That we all relate to God as our creator. We are the creation. And therefore, Shabbat certainly connects into that. Honoring our parents who created us, right? Do not murder. Well, if that's another creation, I can't take that away. So the second set of three talks about creation and our connection to creation. And the third set of three, against adultery, theft, and bearing false witness, these, he argues, are basic ideas on which society needs to stand, right? Adultery, right? We create family units. To break those family units breaks down society. Theft, bearing false witness, if those things happen, we don't have a society that works. Which then leaves only one, right? So what's the Shabbat one? What's the one that kind of falls into that category? Do not covet. So what do we do with that? Why would that one be on its own? You could argue, saying, well, maybe that's just, it's just the extra. Let's put it in without its category. Michal? Yeah. It's a huge challenge, right? Our human desire to want, right? Our human need to gather stuff to us is the basis for just about every failure we have. It really is, if you think about it. It's the basis for just about every failure. And therefore, if you're going to separate one mitzvah, one fundamental idea that needs to sort of stand alone for us to pay attention to it, it's this last one. It's this last one, right? He says, the greatest challenge of any society is how to contain the universal, inevitable phenomenon of envy, the desire to have what belongs to someone else. Envy lies at the heart of violence, right? Everything that we are, as in terms of what we struggle with in this world, can come back in some way to this final commandment. And I find this so interesting because we spend so much of our time on the first ones. We spend so much of our time on honor your parents and Shabbat and those things where we really can understand it. We ignore this one very often. And yet, according to the way Rabbi Sachs looks at this, it's actually the one we should be spending the most time on. We should be thinking about the most. We should be struggling with the most. We should be looking at ourselves and saying, how do we tame that sense of desire for everything else that's in the world? We all have it. It's a reality. It's a fact. How do we tame that? How do we put that into its proper place so that we are not breaking down that very fabric of our society? These four sections, when you put them together, are the message, I would argue, of the Ten Commandments. Understanding that we are connected to God, it's the first three. Understanding that we are part of creation, the second three. Understanding that we have to set up certain rules, even though they limit us, to create a society that functions. And finally, understanding that we have to tame, if we want to live in a society that works, if we want to live with other people, then we need to tame those things within ourselves that are fundamentally destructive. Because otherwise, we'll always be that force that tears down society as opposed to build things up. It's only when I can say it's not what I want, but what other people need, when we make that shift, and so much of Judaism is about making that shift, we respond to this last commandment. And we flip it on its head. All right, well, today you are lucky.